What Russia and China are gleaning from this is that a country like Iran can hold its own against the United States. That while we have a powerful military that was able to conduct strikes to take out the Ayatollah, the leader of Iran, that when it comes to forcing a country into regime change, that is far less feasible.
6 weeks into the war in Iran, we are at a point now of a 2-week-long ceasefire and the talks being planned between the US and Iran. Where do we go from here, and what impact will it have on US foreign policy, as well as what cards does this all give to Russia? We'll discuss all of this with Melissa Toufanian, who was a senior advisor to US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. She's now the Managing Director at Navigator Research here in Washington. Melissa, where do you think the US administration found itself now in the war in Iran? What options do they realistically have? And out of those options, which of them they may realistically pursue?
Well, as we heard yesterday, the United States is pursuing a ceasefire. But what I would say is, based on the reports that we heard after the ceasefire was announced, that what we're not seeing is a ceasefire, but what we're seeing is actually a mess. That I think what we are seeing with Iran and the United States, that the United States is in a weaker position today than it was at the start of the war. The goals that it set out, the objectives, which the goalposts have been shifting consistently. But what we have heard from the United States, from the president, from the vice president, that they wanted a complete obliteration of Iran's missile program, that they wanted to weaken Iranian proxies. Those things have not happened, that Iran retains the ability to continue making the missile program while it may have been hindered, still a threat to the region. We don't know the status of the nuclear program. I think the Iranian proxies can still project power, as we're seeing with the fight in Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel. And I think most important is that the Iranian regime has survived. And I think what we are seeing, time will tell, is that it perhaps has even turned into a more of a hardline regime than what we began with when the president of the United States and Netanyahu from Israel decided to launch this war.
So you described this as a mess. So what the administration can do now to actually get out of this mess?
I hope that the administration takes the diplomatic talks seriously, whether that's mediated through Pakistan or through other intermediaries. I think the most important thing that we can see is for the administration to end this war, to bring the additional U.S. troops that it sent to the region home, to focus on lowering the gas prices, oil prices, the cost of goods that has escalated because of this war, to focus on that. This war, in my view, it's been unnecessary. It's been dangerous. It didn't need to happen in the first place. So to focus on an off-ramp, to de-escalate, to reduce the threats to people, to civilians in the region, to reduce the threats to Americans at home. So I hope that diplomatic talks are successful and that we see this war come to an end as soon as possible. And I hope that we can find an outcome that leaves the United States and those in the region safer, although I'm not optimistic of that.
With this off-ramp, could it be considered by allies or indeed adversaries as, if not the American defeat, that actually the absence of American victory?
I think the absence of American victory is spot on, in that the United States, I think, as I said in the beginning, is in a weaker position today. I think its adversaries, whether China, Russia, or others, have watched what's happened. I think that when it comes to Russia, and particularly with Vladimir Putin, that he would like nothing more than to see the U.S. bogged down in yet another conflict in the Middle East, and another prolonged, costly, unpopular conflict. I think also what Russia and China are gleaning from this is that a country like Iran can hold its own against the United States. That while we have a powerful military that was able to conduct strikes to take out the Ayatollah, the leader of Iran, that when it comes to forcing a country into regime change, that is far less feasible, far less doable. So I think that what our adversaries saw from this is the U.S., some weakness from the United States, and that the United States that this was completely unnecessary and was a war of choice that the president and Netanyahu decided to pursue and exposed this weakness that I then think our adversaries are learning from.
You mentioned Russia. So What new cards this gives Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin to play in terms of their relationship with the United States and with the West?
Well, I think what we're seeing that's really interesting is that because what's happened with the Strait of Hormuz, with Iran blocking the Strait of Hormuz and essentially putting our global economy in a chokehold, we've seen the oil and gas prices increase. We saw the U.S. lift sanctions on Russian oil, allowing Russia to then profit from the sale of that additional oil. And Russia then could use that money to fight the war in Ukraine, where the United States is supporting the Ukrainians. So essentially, we are alleviating the pressure of the increased oil prices by having lifted those sanctions on Russia. But it then provides additional economic support for Russia, the Russian military, to then invest in the war in Ukraine. So I think that Russia has ultimately benefited, has gained from the war with Iran, and has been able to see the U.S. in a position of weakness.
So where does it leave the war in Ukraine and US-led attempts to negotiate a peace solution?
I think it's hard to tell at this point what this would mean vis-a-vis Ukraine. I hope that there can be a diplomatic solution in Ukraine as well. I think that it's really important for the United States to work with allies and partners when it comes to the diplomatic solution in Ukraine. But I think what we are also seeing is that when the U.S. went to allies and partners in Europe and around the world to ask for support for the war in the Middle East, that our allies and partners were not eager to jump in and support. It's almost the complete opposite of what we saw with Ukraine, when allies and partners were rallied together to support Ukraine. So I think this underscores a point that the United States has created unnecessary tension with our allies and partners, particularly our European allies and partners. I think by demanding, in some ways, for their support for the war in the Middle East, that to ask them to partake in this unnecessary, unpopular war, which understandably their own publics would not be supportive of engaging in, of putting their own service members at risk if they were to send troops. That has created tension with our allies and partners. And I hope that doesn't affect a level of support in Ukraine. I don't think it will. But I think that any tension with allies and partners is not helpful overall, especially when we are going to go to them in the future to ask for support for different initiatives, that this puts them in a really tough spot.
You've mentioned the public support. As somebody who served in the previous administration, who's now involved in American public opinion research, what is your take on the mood of the broader American public when it comes to this war?
So what we see from Navigator Research and our own polling is that since the start of the war, the support for the war has remained at about 40% of the American public. About 60% of the American public does not view this war favorably. But what I think is really interesting is that aligns very closely with support overall for President Trump. He's at about a little under 60% approval rating, about 40% approval rating. But when we ask Americans, what are they worried about? What are their concerns when it comes to this war? They are very concerned about being bogged down in yet another prolonged conflict. That this could be billions of dollars of taxpayer money, of U.S. taxpayer money, spent on a conflict in the Middle East. And people want to see their elected officials focus on these issues. They want to see President Trump and Republicans in Congress and others actually lowering their costs, figuring out ways to do that, addressing the economic needs, and not engaging in a war that is actually raising their prices. Many Americans who were coming of age during 9/11, they have known war in the Middle East for most of their lives, whether it's war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, conflict with Libya, and so many other places. And they don't want to experience that. They just want to experience lower costs at home. They want better economic conditions at home. I think they would really like the president and his cabinet to focus on alleviating those rising costs as their greater mission, and to if there is a greater mission to be fought in Iran, I don't think that the last month of conflict has instilled any sort of confidence in them that there is a mission to be, quote unquote, won here.